Well, hello and welcome to Doing Academia Differently in Conversation with Neuroatypicality. This webinar series follows on from a previous webinar series that was titled Post-Philosophies and the Doing of Inquiry. This current webinar is a collaboration between three universities. So one is Ghent University, one is the University of the Western Cape, and the University of Missouri. So Geert Van Hove is from Ghent, Vivienne Bozalek is from UWC, and myself, I'm from the University of Missouri. You also see on the screen today, Nikki Romano is a support and go-to person for the series, as well as an artist who provided beautiful artwork to help us promote the series and on the videos that you see on YouTube. So this webinar series is free with a total of 10 sessions. We meet monthly on the topic of doing academia differently through conversations with neuroatypicality. Each session involves one or two international guests who have had some experience with neuroatypicality in the context of higher education. The webinar series is made possible by a research collaborative partnership between the University of Missouri System in the US, the University of Ghent in Belgium, and the University of Western Cape in Cape Town, South Africa. The partnership between the University of Missouri and UWC started in 1986. UWC and the University of Ghent have had a partnership for more than 20 years. And so thus our three universities have come together in a tri-continental partnership that was set up to promote our institutions supporting each other during a time of travel restrictions due to the global pandemic. The funds were provided to support virtual research and teaching collaborations between faculty members at our institutions. And we are so grateful for our university's longtime collaborations and support of this particular webinar series. These webinars are also available on YouTube. You can find them on our website. If you would like to access the YouTube channel, there's a link there. And once you get to our YouTube channel, you can also click to subscribe to the series to get updates as new ones are posted. Also on YouTube, you can select an option for closed captioning to see the written transcript of the webinar. We have updated our website with exact times for each webinar in order to take into account daylight savings times across the globe and how that affects different contexts. So please check the times posted next to each webinar series or each webinar title on our website. And also note that there's a unique Zoom link for each of the meetings. So today our panelist is Bren LeFrançois, who is a university research professor at Memorial University of Newfoundland and Labrador. So Bren, would you like to unmute and just say a quick hello to everyone? And then Viv will do some more introductions before we get started with our conversation.
Okay, thanks. Yes, hello everyone, and I'm so happy to be here, and I thank you for the invitation.
Thanks, Bren. I also like to introduce Nikki Romano, who is now a PhD graduate from the University of the Western Cape and Utrecht University. And she's a lecturer in art history at Cape Peninsula University of Technology. As Candace said, Nikki's an artist and an art educator, and she's been teaching art to many different groups of people, from children to university students. Nikki's going to be providing the technical support on the webinar platform today, and she's also going to assist with the moderating of the question discussions at the end of the webinar. And we also want to acknowledge Nikki's artworks, which we've used for the series. I'm going to hand over to Nikki now.
Thanks, Viv. I'd like to introduce our three co-hosts. Candace Kuby is the Professor of Learning, Teaching and Curriculum at the University of Missouri, Associate Provost for Faculty Success and the Director of Qualitative Inquiry. Dr. Kuby's research interests are the coming to be of literacies when young children work with artistic and digital tools, approaches to and pedagogies of qualitative inquiry when thinking with post-structuralism and post-human philosophies, She's also the co-author of several books, including Speculative Pedagogies of Qualitative Inquiry, and her scholarship appears in journals that include Qualitative Inquiry, the International Journal of Qualitative Studies in Education, the Journal of Early Childhood Literacy, and the Journal of Literacy Research. Geert Van Hove is Professor in Disability Studies at Ghent University. His field of research is Disability Studies and Inclusive Education. Professor Van Hove was the Disability Studies Professor of the Endowed Chair of Disability Studies at VUMC Amsterdam in the Department of Medical Humanities from 2013 to 2018. In 2017, he was the recipient of the Stephen Taylor Memorial Senior Scholar Award at the Disability Studies in Education Conference in Minneapolis. Vivienne Bozalek is an Emerita Professor in Women and Gender Studies at the University of the Western Cape and Honorary Professor in the Center for Higher Education, Research, Teaching and Learning at Rhodes University. She holds a PhD from Utrecht University. Her research interests and publications include the political ethics of care and social justice, posthumanism and feminist new materialisms, innovative scholarly practices in higher education, and post-qualitative and participatory methodologies. Her most recent co-edited books include Posthuman and Political Care Ethics for Reconfiguring Higher Education, Post-Anthropocentric Social Work, Critical Posthuman and New Materialist Perspectives, and Higher Education Hauntologies, Living with Ghosts for a Justice to Come. These were all published in 2021. Back to you, Candace.
Thanks, Nikki. So for those who are joining us today, you will notice that we're using the Zoom webinar platform instead of a meeting platform. So currently the hosts and those who are the panelists have access to video and audio. But as you might have noticed, as you've joined us for this series, during the question and answer portion, we give the option for all those in attendance to join us with video and audio. So you'll notice you'll get a prompt on your screen that will ask you if you'd like to accept moving into a host position during the Q&A, and that will allow you to be able to unmute and be in dialogue with Bren and each of us a little bit later on. Again, that's optional. You're welcome to stay without video and audio, and you're welcome to type questions into the Q&A button. You'll see that on the bottom of your screen. You can type questions there, and one of us will make sure to voice those to Bren, and so Bren can engage in dialogue with some of your curiosities. So the structure of the webinar is as follows. Viv will ask Bren a number of questions, which we have posed to all the panelists who have taken part in this series, and then we'll open up the space for the Q&A portion for those who are here today to ask questions. We hope to have at least 30 minutes for the Q&A portion, so we'll get started right away with Viv introducing Bren a little more fully and then jumping into our conversation today.
Thanks, Candace. So welcome, Bren. At last, we're having this session. I'm very much looking forward to it. Just a little bit about Bren. Bren LeFrançois is a university research professor at Memorial University of Newfoundland and Labrador, as Candace already said. Their scholarship focuses on psychiatrization, sanism, and anti-sanist praxis, from MAD studies, anti and post-colonial and anarchist perspectives. They've published widely on these and related topics, including co-editing the volume Mad Matters with Robert Menzies and Jeffrey Riolme, who actually was already a guest panelist on our series, and which is currently in its second edition with Idel Abdillahi. Professor LeFrançois obtained an interdisciplinary PhD in England at the University of Kent at Canterbury, and since that time has held faculty positions in Canada at both Laurentian University and Memorial University. Their most recent research project focuses on accommodation and equity issues in relation to disabled students engaging in field practica within health professions. In their spare time, they enjoy backcountry camping, and spending time with their 2 children and 4 cats. So, Bren, I think you are familiar with the questions that I'm going to be posing to you. You've had a look at previous sessions that we've had. So I'm going to jump in and start with, what does neuroatypicality mean, and what does it mean in relation to higher education? And I would also want to ask you after that, how does neuroatypicality relate to MAD studies, and what do you feel about that term, neuroatypicality?
Oh, yes, thanks for asking that kind of question. That I need to start there. That in responding to this question, I use the term neuroatypicality with some caution, and I think that it is contestable on some levels, but I also think that there's value to it in this particular moment. And so what I mean by that is that for me, the concept of neuroatypicality seems to imply a binary, that there are neurotypicals and neuroatypicals. And I find that a bit problematic, because I think that I would prefer us to understand the differences in how we think and how we feel and how we behave to consist more on a continuum of what it means to actually be sentient. And so I think that eventually I'd like us to get to a place where this term doesn't even exist and doesn't need to exist, because we all already understand all of these differences to just be part of what it means to be who we are, rather than for there to be this in-group and this out, right? So I don't know if that makes sense to you or not.
Yeah, it does. I'm just thinking now, because I first came across this word in Erin Manning's work, and I wasn't really familiar with it. And then what sort of intrigued me was that she was using this word neurotypical in the same way as that you use sanist or racist.
Mm-hmm.
She was saying that it's not, we can't see anything like this as located within the individual, but it's actually the system, the neurotypical system that needs looking at. And that, if one is not accommodating difference in any way in higher education, this is what would be regarded as neurotypical. So it's more about, as you've said, in your various papers, it's about the systemic rather than looking at the individual.
Yeah, and that makes sense. And that, for me, is the ways in which this term is valuable at this moment in time, because there are these systemic barriers, the oppression, the harms being done because of the assumption that everybody is so-called neurotypical. And so there is value in this, but I'm hoping for a time where we don't need to use these terms, much in the same way that I hope we eventually don't have to use terms like racism and racist and talk about or live within racist structures, because I'd like to see us do away with all of them, basically. So important terms, but terms that I think neuroatypicality has a particular usefulness to us right now in our understandings of how we live within and are trying to change higher education.
Do you think it's also useful in terms of seeing sentience in a more sort of expansive way?
Sorry, can you repeat that? I lost you.
You were talking about sentience. Do you
Yeah.
think that it's useful in seeing more expansive forms of sentience as being valuable?
I think so. And I think that in my writing up to date, I have been talking about, this continuum and what it means to be human. And I was thinking over this question even just yesterday, thinking, why are we talking about being human, and why are we not broadening this understanding? And that helps us to try to fathom the unknowns of how other sentient beings or things are thinking or feeling or behaving, instead of limiting it all the time to who we are as human, as of central importance to the world, which of course is so damaging on so many levels, right? So
yeah.
So I'm trying to change my language and my way of thinking, and I'm trying to do that in the academy. I'm trying to do that for others. I'm trying to do it for myself as well, broadening these epistemological questions of the unknown and what we don't know about and what we can't even fathom, and trying to open up space to learn about and to potentially be impacted by. So I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, and so maybe I should go back to your question about now that we've tackled this term neuroatypicality. I wanted to say, in response to your question of what this means for higher education, is I think that neuroatypicality has the potential to actually shake the foundations of higher education, and I think to shift what is considered valuable knowledge, both historically and currently in higher education. But I suppose I should start off by explaining my lens and where I'm coming from. And my lens is that of Mad Studies. And just to explain to folks, I entered Mad Studies not through the typical route of critical disability studies, but instead I entered it via critical mental health and critical psychology traditions. So I entered via that route, but I'm also still very much appreciating the kind of deep analyses that are taking place in critical disability studies that is actually enriching Mad Studies and how we think about all of these differences. And so that being the case, Mad Studies itself, and I think that Jeffrey Room talked a lot about the roots of Mad Studies and what it is in his talk. So if folks haven't listened to that, I direct you to the recording of Jeffrey's conversation in this series. But I will say a little bit to help folks who may not have a background in Mad Studies. Mad Studies has its roots in what I would call grassroots mad social movements, and in these spaces where activists were and continue to oppose and resist the kind of oppression that people are experiencing within mental health services. And what I think is important about that is, I think that the root of that oppression that's being fought, that's being resisted, part of the root, maybe not the entire root, but part of one thread of those roots has its origins in the ways in which students of mental health professions are taught within higher education. So there's a very sort of narrow understanding of madness as illness, as mental illness, and a way of teaching about that within higher education that I think is so narrow and so limiting, and some would argue harmful, that it produces or helps to produce the kind of oppressive experiences people have when they're in contact and engage with services as a service user or a client or a patient. And so what MAD Studies does, which is really exciting, I believe, is that it kind of explodes and blossoms this understanding of MAD people and MAD experiences into a much broader understanding and heterogeneous understandings as well. So there's no singular understanding of madness and MAD people within MAD Studies. And so what that does, I think, when we bring MAD Studies from these grassroots MAD communities and bring them into higher education, what happens is that we start to subvert the kind of narrow understandings that are traditionally been taught within higher education. Not only the way that, what kind of outcome that might have for students within professional schools, but also I think what it does is it shakes up and questions the kind of Enlightenment notions of rationality and what constitutes reason and what kind of logic is considered valuable in the academy itself. So a higher education has started with this kind of value system of what knowledge is valuable, what is non-knowledge, what is dangerous knowledge, and what is just non-existent. And so what I think happens here is that we start to shake this up and we start to open up this space. And that's why I say that I think neurotypicality has the potential to really shake the foundations of the university because of the way in which it was built on these ideas. So I don't know if that answers the question or
yeah, that's very helpful as a start. I was just wondering now, it seems very plausible that this could bring sort of new ways of thinking and also new ways of doing things in academia.
Mm-hmm.
But how would it sort of differ from, critical feminist or anti-racist or critical race studies or sort of, which have been around for some time and have been contesting things like rationality and reason, affect studies, those sorts of things. Do you think MAD Studies is joining all those things, or how is it providing more than?
I think,
what is it that about MAD Studies that is, challenging rationality even more than it has been by those others?
well, here's the thing. I'm not entirely sure that it's challenging. It's in more than what these other disciplines, these other approaches have been doing. But my way of thinking about it is that if at the same time, and it's not just MAD Studies, I would include critical disability studies and neurodiversity studies, as we're shaking the foundations at the same time as the Marxists and the feminists have been for a very long time, at the same time as critical race theorists and indigenous studies, etc. If we're doing this all at the same time, it's going to have an eventual impact of shifting. And so I think that what we have is another lens and more voices to be included within that critical tradition. I also think that some of the concepts and MAD Studies, I think what it does is it deeply unsettles notions of what is normal and what is abnormal. We know that to a certain extent, some of these other disciplines do the same thing, but we're doing so from a particular vantage point, which may be unsettling to other critical scholars as well. And so here we are thinking about doing this critique all at the same time and influencing each other and becoming more powerful. sophisticated as we learn from each other and as we continue to shake the foundations and affect change. So I don't know how Pollyanna that sounds, but I do actually think that there's a lot of hope in us being able to, through these types of collaborations and working together, or working alongside each other with respect, that we have the opportunity to change the university, to change higher education. I say that all in a context where we're dealing with, most recently, really strong neoliberal kind of trends in the university, where, you know, business models are being brought in, where industry and capital is engaging in partnerships with higher education, where the concept of the public university is shrinking. And so our task in this kind of context is really, really difficult, right? And certainly more difficult than I would think it was 30 or 40 years ago even.
Yeah, it does seem like things are much more difficult and getting more difficult. Could you provide some examples of how you think that higher education might be reconfigured using MAD studies?
Okay,
Do you
well,
have any ways? I mean, you've written about, for example, research methodologies. And I'm wondering about pedagogy. You've said something about health professions practica. So maybe those are some examples you could refer to.
yeah, so well, I think that on a day-to-day practical level, we need to be pushing the boundaries and opening up spaces for accommodations for disabled students, but also disabled faculty, but disabled professors, disabled staff members, because what I'm seeing in the university is that we're gaining entrance into the university, but to a certain extent, we're being expected to assimilate and either do so or fail and leave. And I don't want to, I know you're asking for examples, but I just have to go back to this theoretical conversation that you've inspired me with in your article around Derrida's concept of who is a host and what is hospitable and what is hostility, etc. And if I apply this to higher education, what I see is that disabled body minds are certainly invited into the university, but once we get in, it's this conditional hospitality that we receive, where we're expected to assimilate, we're not expected to change things, we're not expected to be accommodated. And so it's actually a hostile environment rather than a hospitable one. And so some of the research that I'm doing now with a national study across Canada, we're looking at this question of accommodation of students. And I should say first too, that I think that when we ask for accommodations, it tends to be interpreted, maybe not in all spaces in all universities, but certainly in many of them, it tends to be interpreted as not an equity issue, but an issue of asking for privileges and somehow becoming through those accommodations privileged members of the university. And these are stereotypes and misunderstandings that really need to be broken down. And I think it's really hard to do that. I know of a number of disabled professors, for example, who are in hiding, who won't even ask for accommodations or tell the administration that they're disabled for fear of retaliation and the way they'll be treated. And these are folks with obviously with invisible disabilities, right? And so there's so much work to be done to make the university a more hospitable and a less hostile place for not just students, but also for faculty and staff. Now, going back to this research, we are looking at the ways in which students are being accommodated in their field practicum. So this is students within health professions like nursing, social work, occupational therapy, medicine, psychology, those types of fields, where part of their university degree means leaving the university, going to a community organization or a clinic to do a term of work study. And we haven't fully analyzed the data yet, but what it seems to be that we're finding is that disabled students, neuroatypical students, MAD students many don't know that they can ask for accommodations. Many ask and do not receive accommodations, and ultimately are not really able to be full participants in this educational process. And so what we have are students who are not necessarily getting the full learning experience, but they're also not in a position to fully be able to have an impact on those clinics and organizations, and to kind of make meaning and teach as they're learning. And so there's so much work to be done inside the university, but also outside of the university for students. And some students don't want to ask for accommodations because they're fearful that these may be the very organizations that will hire them once they graduate, and that they won't do so if they knew that they could use accommodations and that they have some form of disability. And so disability remains invisible on so many levels, other than in the cases where people cannot hide that disability, right? So I don't know.
You talk about accommodations. So what sort of accommodations could they access?
Well, there could be requests for, what we call crip time, where it's understood that sometimes students and even faculty who identify in some way as neuroatypical may require periods of not being, not participating in the educational process. There may be issues of needing to have schedule changes. So for example, if some folks are on medications that may make them very drowsy in the morning, making sure that they're scheduled into educational experiences in the afternoons or in the evenings. So there's all sorts of different types of accommodations that people that might be supportive of people. And I don't know that we've even started to list what all of those might be. And of course, when we're talking about neuroatypicality, we're talking about such a heterogeneous set of experiences that there may be many things that we haven't yet even thought of that might actually help people fit better within higher education. And so that's a problem too. We haven't even, perhaps not that I know of, maybe some people have begun to do so and to make demands. I know that there's some good folks working at different universities where they're trying to, they're setting up disability caucuses, they're setting up groups for MAD and disabled people so that some of the structures of the university can be changed and to promote better understandings of what accommodation is from an equity standpoint.
Yeah, but isn't accommodation also, sort of assuming that it's the person that has to fit into the institution rather than the institution learning from, you know, whoever's there, and also gaining from, you know, what they have to bring to the institution.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think that those of us who are in higher education right now, we're finding ways of pushing barriers. We're finding ways of trying to change the structures and the strictures of higher education so that it not kind of pushing the structures so that we more people can fit in and maintaining this rigidity, but instead trying to build systems that are more flexible within the university so that it's not always about this individual's needs, but instead having more of a flexible kind of understanding of the university. Now that's a big grand desire that I think we're trying to, some of us are trying to move toward.
Yeah. Yeah, because if one is starting off from the perspective of valuing difference, it's an entirely different way of going about, you know, the academic project, isn't it?
I think so. Yeah, yeah. And so so those are good examples, I think, of what was the question that you had originally asked me? I'm trying to go back to.
Well, that's about reconfiguring higher education, but
Yeah.
I think you've given some good examples.
And that's about, you know, the politics and the policies and some of those higher structures. But I'm also thinking that there's things to be said about what we're doing in our classrooms, in our teaching and learning, in our research. And I think particularly about my own teaching where, you know, I'm pushing boundaries in the content that I'm providing in my teaching, where I'm getting, opening up a space to think more widely than the narrow ways that we tend to think about issues around madness as mental illness, for example. But it's not just the content, it's also the pedagogical practices. And so I think about something that Anna Donskoy has written about. She talks about the poetics of resistance. And I really like this imagery of kind of affecting change, trying to change what is harmful and what is painful through a sort of artistic and beautiful process. And that's not to glorify it too much, because it is hard work that those of us who are trying to teach against the grain are actually doing. But for example, in my teaching, I value emotional intelligence. I value experiential knowledge. I value knowledges that are not usually considered appropriate within higher education. And I also, when my classes are small enough, I'll do things like I will teach in circle. And early in my career, I was mentored by some Indigenous scholars around teaching in circle and honoring and starting with experiential knowledge. So then you start with the knowledge that students are bringing in on particular topics, and we start there, and then we start to interact with some of these other ways of knowing, so that we're all being challenged to think differently, including myself, by honoring those knowledges that are coming in, if you see what I mean. So this is hard work, right? This is hard work doing things differently in the university. So I don't know if I've
just an extension of that. Have you ever tried different things in terms of the so-called grading system, and you know what students need to do for that?
Oh, absolutely. What I do and I don't know if I go as far as other folks because, we've been constrained as well recently in the past couple of years with COVID times. But I have assignments and I give students opportunities to choose how that assignment will be structured. Will it be an oral presentation? Will it be a written piece? Will it be something you do individual? Will it be something you collaborate with other students on? And so the general topic and the criteria for the assignments are laid out for students, but they are given a choice of which way makes most sense for them or is consistent with their own individual ways of learning and knowing. To a certain extent, I think there's probably much more I could be doing around this, but that's how I'm starting to think about what that means. And then I don't have so much the issue of individual students coming to me saying I need accommodations, because the accommodations tend to be built into the assignments for everyone. And so that, students aren't being pinpointed or individualized in that way. But yeah.
Shall we go on to the next question, which is about it's that mouthful of the ethico-onto-epistemological concerns, and I would add politico, and I think that your writings, deal with all these issues actually, and their entanglement. I was particularly interested in what you, and I can't remember which co-author it was talking about resisting positivism and about sanist research designs, data collection and methods, and what are alternatives to these sanist ways of doing things, and is it just a critique of positivism, or is it are sanist ways of doing things different from positivist ways of doing things?
I think they're completely intertwined. Positivism and I go broader than positivism. I think that's true in the context of research, but I also go back to this broader understanding of what is understood to be rational. What are the narrow confines of reason and reasoning that are allowed in the academy? Those are inherently sanist, but they're also inherently racist and perhaps inherently sexist. And so this goes back to our further discussion about how there are other critical scholars from other fields who are challenging these issues as well. But there are particular issues in relation to mental illness and how that is researched and how it is taught in higher education. And I think you're referring to the chapter that I wrote with Gigi Veronka, and where we elaborate, or we don't elaborate on, actually, we just introduce our initial thoughts around what we've called the ethics of unruliness. And I think that what we're hoping with that is that other folks will pick this up and further develop it and make it more sophisticated for our purposes, so that we can start to think about how we can move away from the kind of white Western epistemes that dominate the academy, that dominate higher education, that dominate our understandings of madness. And what this ethics of unruliness does is it suggests that we should be embracing disorderliness, that we should be openly contesting sanism and racism, everywhere we see it. And through that process, we might start to unveil the kind of unheard of knowledges or the unknowns of what it means, different ways of knowing and feeling and doing. Because right now we're in this tiny little box where we only have this very narrow conceptualization of what it means to feel and to do and to be in the world and to understand the world. And so I don't know if that is a critique beyond positivism. I think it goes a little bit beyond that. And, you know, I think it's really just about radically calling into question what the academy counts as knowledge, and how what they often count as knowledge can be really harmful and demeaning to folks who may identify as neuroatypical in some way. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. I think it's very exciting, and you're saying that you're hoping other people take it forward, but I was hoping you would be taking it forward too, because I do think it's very exciting. And I just wondered if you had any examples of students who you think have used unruly practices, and you know what could perhaps emanate from that.
Well,
or you yourself have used any.
I can think of many examples of unruliness amongst students and their work that is often disciplined within the academy in ways that are very, very dangerous and damaging to not just individuals, but to everybody within that space. And I think that unruliness becomes more allowable when students, and I'm thinking particularly of postgraduate students, when they're engaging in work in their research and their theorizing with academics who are open to the unknown and to being unsettled and to being uncomfortable. You'd like an example? I'm trying to think.
No, it's fine. We'll watch that space.
Yeah.
Yeah,
you know, I think Elise DeBee's work is probably really important around there. And so in your next webinar, that might be something that they are able to speak to as well, the sorts of things. And I say this because I was on Elise's on their dissertation committee, and so I think they have probably many examples of how that unruliness was both allowable and at times not allowable, and how boundaries are pushed every day by students, not just by academics.
Yeah, you've written a lot about epistemic injustice and hermeneutic injustice. So maybe you could just elaborate a little on that. I mean, Miranda Fricker's written about it, but I don't know. It's really sort of pertained to children in terms of race, but I haven't seen it applied that much to madness before. So maybe you could just say a little about it.
Well, yes, and I think this just goes back to the narrow understandings of madness as mental illness in higher education, and how that actually is a form of epistemic injustice because of the way it bars people's experiential understandings of their experiences, of the way that it silences, of the way that it not just silences, but deems experiential understandings of madness as somehow dangerous and wrong and not to be heard or studied or understood. And so people get silenced, and hermeneutically, I think the issue is more around the lack of space, the lack of audience, the lack of a platform from which to be heard and to be understood. And I think that's one of the major things that needs to change in higher education, is creating that space. And I think that's what we're doing to a certain extent in Mad Studies, is opening up that space for justice in relation to multiple understandings of madness to flourish and to be studied and to be understood. So I think we're trying to engage in that work. And again, that links back to the poetics of resistance. So resisting that injustice and creating spaces for ourselves and others to enter higher education. And so I think that's at the crux of Mad Studies' attempts to kind of destable and to undo and overturn those types of injustices. And so we are teaching against the grain, we are researching, so are students. And so we're opening up a space for that to take place, for epistemological and ontological differences. And that's uncomfortable for some, but it needs to be uncomfortable. And this, I think, all of this is intertwined with shaking the foundations of the institution. It's all interrelated, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree that even the field of Mad Studies is a way of creating space for doing things differently. I see that we've got about 5 minutes left before we want to open up for questions. So a lot of your work has actually sort of related Mad Studies very squarely with post-coloniality, with, I don't know if you would incorporate decoloniality. And I mean, particularly the one article, I can't remember which one, it might have been the child as metaphor. But, you spoke a lot about the developmental discourses and how they pertain across these different categories. So if you'd just like to, that's the last question. How is the ethics of unruliness sort of across these fields talking to each other?
This is my favorite question, and I have so much I could say about it. I don't think it's going to happen in 5 minutes, but I would also say that I would include an anti-colonial analysis and those conversations into this discussion, and especially coming from and living in a white settler state where, white folks are still here. We haven't left, right? And so these anti-colonial conversations remain just as important as the decolonial and the post-colonial. But what I want to say before I even get to that question is that I think that these conversations are important in every discipline, not just in Mad Studies and disability studies, in every discipline across higher education. And so I'm thinking, these conversations intersect even with, engineering, with biology, with advanced quadratics and calculus, for example, as well as, in all of the sciences, as well as within humanities and the social sciences. And I think that everyone in higher education is accountable on some level to the colonial and neo-colonial violences that continue to take place. And so I think for me, the question is whether those intersections are ignored by individual academics, whether they're made invisible, or whether folks just choose not to engage with these conversations. I think they need to be. And I'll give you the example when I invoke advanced quadratics in calculus. What I'm suggesting is that there's this holding firm in higher education of a certain narrow understanding of rationality and reasoning. It's about scientific method, it's about objectivity, as being the most highly valued form of knowledge that we have in higher education. And so when we think about advanced mathematics, I'm not saying that it's not important and valuable knowledge, not at all. I think it is. I think it's very complex knowledge, especially for folks who aren't mathematicians. But what I'm suggesting is that with these equations and with the type of problem solving that takes place within calculus, there is room for other ontological, other worldviews, other epistemological understandings that takes a step back and says, well, there may be other ways to actually tackle this type of problem solving. Or maybe we need to start by questioning whether this problem is a problem and or whether it needs to be solved at all. And so what I'm suggesting is that these conversations should be taking place not just in the social sciences or the humanities, but across the university. And I think it's important to underscore that. And this is about white Western epistemes and making space for other knowledges and thinking that in a broad sense. So what am I going to say now about the intersections? I think that when we talk about neuroatypicality and its intersections with anti-colonial, post-colonial, decolonial conversations, that those intersections have been present, I think, and strikingly present since the beginning of the colonial project. And, if we look just at the white Western world, we see how disabled people have been debased as being other, as being outside of the norm. So there was this development of the normal curve, which is shaped like a bell and positions some people as normal and some people as abnormal. And guess who sits in the normal section of that bell curve, right? It's the white Western able-bodied, and I would argue sane male subject. And so this curve, this bell curve, this normal curve has been used not just to debase disabled people, but also to debase whole groups of colonized people. So I don't know how much time we have for this, but I do want to say that, at the beginning of the colonial project, colonizers wanted to sell this idea of colonizing other countries, and they framed it as this benevolent project that these people are inferior, they are abnormal, they are outside of this normal curve. And what we're actually doing is we're going to these countries and we are going to help them. We're going to guide them like parents and children. We're going to guide and support and help them develop into, i.e. assimilate into how we think and do and feel in the world. And sadly enough, this lie worked. And I think that when you look at people living within the colonizers' countries, there is this general sense, both historically and currently, that colonizing people was a beneficial and important and valuable thing to have done. So this is really, really problematic to have this, this lie work in such a way. And so what I think we need to do is that we need to bust this curve, this concept of normal and abnormal. And I think that that's what we're trying to do in critical disability studies and MAD studies, is to move away from that, to break it, to bash it, and to suggest that, and to make visible in the first place that this is not helpful, nor is it true. And so I see neurodiversity studies, math studies, critical disability studies, as well as Indigenous studies, critical race studies, engaging in that very busting of the normal curve. And so these conversations are already connected. And I don't think that we, within discussions of neuroatypicality or disability or madness, I don't think that we can ever discuss these issues without also at the same time discussing colonial and violence and engaging in those conversations that are taking place predominantly by Indigenous scholars. And I also think we need to be engaging in conversations around racism and the kind of critical race analyses that are taking place right now. And just to end, I want to say that I think that this is important, not just because of this historical, deeply entrenched and intersecting issues that I've just raised, but also because what we see in the global north, at least in the present day, is that Black and Indigenous disabled people, I think, are disproportionately being targeted for the most severe and involuntary forms of diagnosis and treatments under this guise of medical authority. And so we need to keep combating that and to breaking the medical authority that allows this deeming of normal and normal, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. But I must say, you know, the medical profession seems quite a powerful opponent. That's the worrying thing. And they sort of hold a lot of credibility. And so it's quite a big fight, I think. It's quite a big battle.
It absolutely is. But again, I maintain that there is hope. And I maintain that, you know, these conversations with allies outside of MAD studies is going to help to bring that about.
Yeah, very important. Well, thanks for answering all the questions. It was a bit of a dream. I don't think I even had to consult my notes much. So it went very smoothly in my estimation, and that's because, you know, you had already addressed all this in what I had read, which I so enjoyed all your chapters and your pieces. I want to read your anarchism one now.
Okay, which I didn't touch on at all, but yeah.
No, you didn't. I'm very interested in how that also pertains to what you've been talking about. But I'm going to hand over to the others because I'm keen for people to interact with you.
Okay, thank you.
So yeah, we'll move into dialogue now. And as I mentioned at the beginning, I think Nikki and myself, we can click on each person's name and give you the option to become a co-host, which will allow you to have audio and video functions. And so we'll work on that shortly. At the same time, there is a question and answer button or box at the bottom of the screen. You're more than welcome to just type your questions there, and one of us will do our best to voice those for Bren to respond to. So we'll kind of move on those logistical things right now, but I also wondered if Nikki or Geert, if you have questions that you want to start with as we wait for some others to come in. Happy for you to get us started with some conversation.
I'll go first, just to say that everybody's declined to be promoted as panelists.
I won't try to promote them again, but encourage them to post questions for us.
It's so quick, they will decline. But what I would like to, well, I'm curious about the anarchism, but what I want to thank you for, Bren, is the hope. And you said something earlier about exploding and blossoming. And I thought that was very beautiful, actually, because I wouldn't have put those two together, firstly. And I also wonder if you could talk more about hope, because you know, just again, experiencing what's happening in the institution where I work, where it's ever more rigid. It feels, you know, not in terms of the pedagogies or the time, what happens in the classroom, but certainly in terms of the demands and the measures that the institution is putting in place so firmly that it's quite hard to imagine how it feels like there's less and less air to breathe with in the kind of neoliberal university. So if you would please give us some more hope.
Oh, I don't write about hope. I don't know that I even spend much time thinking about hope, because I tend to spend a lot of time feeling very demoralized. I get excited about some of the changes that in the scholarship and the things that people are doing. I get excited when I see people doing things differently than I've even conceptualized. And that gives me moments of hope and moments of excitement. And then, doors get slammed in your face, and administrations make things harder for us to do things differently. And I get in this cycle of being very demoralized. Perhaps right now I'm feeling more hopeful. And I think as long as there are academic activists in higher education, there will always be hope, even though we tend to go through this cycle of being burnt out, and then a flurry of energetic changes happen, and then we need to rest again. But maybe I have to leave it at that. As long as there are academic activists and critically minded scholars, there is always hope. And frankly, I think the more the university tries to turn into businesses, the stronger people in the higher education are going to fight back. I see people fighting back now, and I think more people than the typical suspects of those who we know are activists already in the academy and higher education. I think other folks are going to come and try to work together to stop the process that we see happening. And I know in different countries, the stages that we're at is worse than other places. And in Canada, at least, we're still holding on to our tenure system. But, the ways in which as academics we're allowed to engage in decision-making and governance within the university is becoming more and more squeezed. And it's harder and harder to affect the changes that we need to affect to make more body minds comfortable within this space. Sorry if that wasn't much hope, but it's a little.
It's infectious as well.
So Bren, but not by coincidence, I think there is a kind of vibe within this meeting. I fell in love with your hope too, but we won't talk about this because it took me back to Paulo Freire and his book about hope while he was working with people living in poverty. Mm-hmm. But I have a completely, or not a completely different, but a different question. I know thousands of people who take a course of critical psychology and don't do anything with it. And as I understood you well, you said, I entered the field because of critical psychology, or through the door of critical psychology. Mm-hmm. What made the difference? Because all the other ones who followed the course with you and went on to become a very well-paid clinical psychologist who is giving therapy to people who are paying them a lot of money. So I really respect the idea that you respect critical psychology as a very important bridge for you to enter the field. But where can we understand? How can we understand better the trigger within this
I think I have something to say about that. I fell in love with critical psychology when I was a PhD student. When I first fell into it, I have an undergraduate degree in psychology, and my PhD was an interdisciplinary degree, but it was in applied psychology. And I found my home theoretically within critical psychology at that point in time. And here's the thing. When I tried to get an academic position in psychology, having gone that route, I was not able to get a position anywhere. And because I think that, you know, the white Western epistemes within psychology are extremely rigid. And so what I found myself kind of accidentally is being accepted, or sort of initially accepted into social work. So the kind of understandings of social justice that I was trying to bring into psychology was better understood in social work. So I started working as an academic in social work. And so that was a space where I was allowed entrance. And I wonder with other critical psychologists if they're just not able to follow through with the principles and the values and the ideas of critical psychology once they graduate, and once they try to start working in the field of psychology. That again, it's either assimilate or fail and leave, right? And so maybe I'm venturing really assimilate back into mainstream and perhaps harmful ways of doing and understanding psychology. For me, I was allowed to carry on, but I sort of started to kind of think more broadly about my scholarship, and then it eventually fitted into math studies. But here's the thing that I think is important too, is that I talk about teaching against the grain in my classes when I'm teaching social workers. And I really want to actually do a study to see what happens to those students who seem, for the most part, there's always a few students who continue to push back and are unhappy with thinking differently about madness. But I think the bulk of students tend to get very excited by the possibilities. And what I'd like to know is what happens to them once they graduate. And my hunch is that once you become, you start working within an organization that has a particular culture of care that is similar to those narrow epistemological understandings that we find in the university, that there's an assimilation process that takes place as well. But I'm not sure. I'd like, I think I need to study, just go back to all of my former students and say, what are you doing now? And what does it look like? And does it resemble anything that you or others discussed in the space of the classroom?
Thank you for that. We had a wise colleague within disability studies who asked all his colleagues the same question you are now thinking about. Why are you doing what you are doing now? Where was the moment? And there were other ones in same groups who are doing, I don't know, business things in university environments. Thank you. Thank you.
I'm wondering if we have any questions from participants? People who are.
I don't see it yet, but that is a great invitation. If our attendees have things they're curious about, feel free to type them the Q&A box or in the chat box. We can probably catch them there too.
I could talk a little bit about anarchism and my first attempts to write about that. I think a couple of people raised that, and my entrance into anarchist thinking started as an activist within a particular MAG community, where it was a very sort of more narrow understanding of anarchism in terms of what it means to abolish state institutions that are harmful. So things like forced psychiatric hospitalization, forced treatment, but also in relation to things like prison abolition and even discussions of how incredibly harmful the child welfare system is. And that's another perhaps conversation for another day. But so I started off sort of pre higher education, thinking about what these forms of abolition and understanding that as anarchist with a small a maybe. And once I started doing my PhD, I took on more of a rights perspective, because so much of what was happening in the critical mental health literature was about patient rights, was about, and in the case of my research in relation to children's rights. So I kind of steered away into this rights-based approach, which, you know, after many years of thinking about how that might be useful, I've come to realize that in effect, it's actually probably a more harmful way of trying to understand how to affect change, because of the way it absorbs us and changes into neoliberal agendas whenever. It's a longer conversation. But so I guess recently I've decided to turn back and look at anarchism from a wider lens, and to even think about the kind of alternative forms of treatment that that have been developed and that take place within MAG communities, and how that in itself is a form of anarchist practice. I believe it's outside of government control. It's about voluntary association. Nobody's mandating or forcing you to do or act or be treated in a certain way. And so I spent some time during the beginning part of this pandemic starting to envision how we may all live differently in a much wider way than just alternative off the grid kind of services. And I think I felt provoked by that, particularly by seeing the way people come together spontaneously during kind of natural disasters or during difficult times, and about how I don't think, you know, the critique of anarchism as being idealistic is actually a very good critique at all. I think it's almost our default where we turn to is our communities and helping each other. And so I've written something that I'm trying to envision how things might look differently. And I was inspired when I was listening to Erin Manning's talk with you as well, because of course she's living off the grid and engaging in this project that is, I guess what I would understand is just terrifyingly beautiful, right? Because it's so difficult to start that process of actually living differently in a wider way outside of the capitalist system, outside of the state and its oppressive arms. So I'm not sure that I have much more to say other than to say that I'm at the beginnings of these thinking through.
Yeah, it's exciting. I was just thinking of those who know Chantal Gray, who's just written a book about anarchism, but I'm not so sure how comprehensible it is, because Bren and I were just talking about how inaccessible post-human literature is. And, you know, they're Deleuzian, and Deleuze and Guattari are their sort of go-to people. And so they've, I think, written a book on Deleuze and anarchism. They're sort of ardent anarchists. But I did think that you would approve of the notion of normopathy, which comes from Guattari. I think it's a very nice notion. Sort of turning pathology on its head.
Absolutely. And, you know, like I said, I have these stacks of books because I keep buying them because I know they're good, and they're all, you know, in this general area of posthumanism, and I keep reading pages and throwing it across the room because I can't attend to the language. And it's not like I have a problem with theory, because I understand myself to be a theoretician before anything else. And yet there's some kind of barrier that I haven't broke through yet. But I always appreciate listening to conversations and talks that other people who are embedded within these theoretical perspectives, because it speaks to me always, just not so much, I don't know, when I'm trying to read it. So.
But as you were saying, I think it's also because it's coming from a sort of humanities perspective, and we are sort of have come from a social science. Yeah. And I'm more au fait with those sorts of, you know, ways of engaging with the world.
Could be my aging as well, and my becoming too comfortable with social sciences and those critiques. And again, that I need to problematize. I'm not opening myself up as well to other ways of thinking and understanding. But of course, I've been told by more than one academic that the work that I'm doing already is posthumanist. It's just not using that material in obvious ways. So,
well, certainly your reference to transdisciplinarity is you know, has a lot of resonances there. Yeah. No other questions?
But perhaps, you know, we're 2 minutes to closing, so perhaps we can just start ending off now and saying thanks again to all the attendees for joining us today. And as we stated before, the webinar is recorded, and we'll work to post information on the webinar series webpage on how to access the recording on YouTube. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel to receive updates when a new recording is posted. And just as a reminder, our next webinar is on the 16th of June, 2022. Alice de B, postdoctoral research fellow at McMaster University in Canada, will be presenting. I think that's all for now. Denise says, here, great and comprehensive session.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
Yeah, thank you
for engaging with my thinking.
I hope we can continue our beginning conversations, actually.
And as we have learned, it's good to be a little bit nervous before the session, then we'll end up with a beautiful, very clear session. Thank you, Bren, for all your insights.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thanks. And Candace had to leave early, and so she says goodbye as well, and thank you.
Okay, thank you to everyone.
Okay.